David thought it was just another family argument brewing on the horizon, a distant thunder that had become the background noise of his marriage to Sarah. He didn't know that this time, Sarah had done more than just vent to her family. She had summoned them. He stood on his own porch, the polished oak cool beneath his bare feet, and watched them pull up. One truck, then another, then a procession of cars, disgorging a small army onto his manicured lawn. His wife's 6 brothers. And they had brought friends. 12 of them. 18 men in total, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around the flagstone path that led to his front door. They moved with the unearned confidence of a pack, their shoulders broad, their expressions ranging from smug to openly hostile. What none of them knew, what even Sarah had never fully understood, was that the quiet architect they were about to threaten, the man they saw as a soft-handed intellectual who designed historical restorations, had spent a decade operating in places that didn't appear on any tourist map. The quiet man who preferred blueprints to brawls had once been a Green Beret. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? Judged by our appearance or our quiet nature. It's a frustrating feeling, knowing you're more than what people see. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy stories where the quiet ones finally reveal their true strength, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You are not going to want to miss a single moment of how this ends. David's mind, a place usually filled with load-bearing calculations and the elegant lines of colonial-era architecture, became a different kind of calculating machine. 18 hostels. No visible firearms, but that meant little. Hands were the first weapon. He cataloged them instinctively. The lead brother, Mark, was the mouth. Arrogant, used to being in charge, positioned at the center. His stance was wide, a peacock's display of dominance. To his left, the youngest brother, Kevin, fidgeted, his anger a brittle thing born of insecurity. The others were a mix of muscle and simmering resentment, their friends acting as a chorus of intimidation. David's gaze swept the environment, not as a homeowner admiring his garden, but as an operator assessing a tactical situation. The heavy ceramic pots flanking the door could provide cover or be used as weapons. The garden hose, coiled neatly by the spigot, could be a tripwire or a restraint. The low stone wall bordering the flower beds offered a defensive perimeter. His heart rate remained steady, a calm and metronomic 60 beats per minute. His breathing was deep and even. Outwardly, he was a picture of unnerving stillness. Inwardly, the architect had left the building. The soldier was on watch. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, framed by the warm light of their home. She was twisting a dish towel in her hands, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at him, but at her brothers, her expression a toxic cocktail of fear, guilt, and a desperate plea for approval. She was the silent enabler, the one who had unlocked the gate and let the wolves into the yard. Her betrayal was a colder, sharper threat than the 18 men arrayed before him. Mark stepped forward, his work boots crunching on the gravel of the path. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps, planting his feet as if claiming the ground. "David," he said, the name an insult on his tongue. "We need to talk." "I'm right here, Mark," David replied, his voice even, devoid of the tremor the other man expected. He didn't raise it, yet it carried across the lawn with absolute clarity. The lack of fear was the first crack in their confidence, though they didn't recognize it yet. They had come expecting a trembling, apologetic man, a man they could easily overwhelm with their numbers and their volume. David's calm was a language they didn't speak. To them, it looked like weakness, like a man too stunned or stupid to understand the danger he was in. They saw a sheep. They failed to see the shepherd's discipline, the wolf's patience. They had come to his home to teach him a lesson, to put him in his place. The irony, David thought with a flicker of grim humor, was that they were about to get a lesson of their own, one far more profound and permanent than they could ever imagine. The first rule of engagement, one he had learned in the dust of Afghanistan, was to never, ever underestimate your opponent. It was a rule his brothers-in-law were about to learn the hard way. Mark cleared his throat, puffing out his chest as he began to lay out the family's list of grievances. It was a litany of perceived slights, a catalogue of ways David had failed to meet their brutish standard of manhood. The recitation was for the benefit of the assembled audience, a performance of dominance. "Sarah is unhappy, David," Mark began, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "She comes to us, her family, because her husband is supposed to be her protector, her rock. But you're not a rock. You're sand." A few of the men behind him chuckled, the sound ugly and sharp in the evening air. David remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Mark, letting the man talk, letting him expose his entire strategy. It was all about humiliation. "You embarrassed Kevin at the family dinner last Sunday," Mark continued, gesturing to the youngest brother. Kevin flushed, a mixture of shame and renewed anger on his face. "You corrected him, in front of everyone, about some stupid historical fact. You made him feel small." David remembered the moment perfectly. Kevin had been loudly and incorrectly boasting about the history of the town hall, a building David was currently leading the project to restore. David had gently and privately corrected one of his more egregious errors. He hadn't been mocking, merely accurate. But in their world, being corrected by an outsider, an intellectual, was an intolerable insult. "And you refuse to invest in my new business," Mark added, his voice rising in pitch. This was the real heart of it, the financial core of their resentment. "I offer you a chance to get in on the ground floor. A real man's business. Construction. Not playing with old buildings. And you turn me down. You disrespect me. You disrespect this family." The insults kept coming, each one designed to chip away at his dignity. They called him soft, bookish. They mocked the way he spoke, the clothes he wore, the quiet, deliberate way he moved. With every word, David felt not anger, but a profound sense of detachment. It was as if he were observing a poorly staged play. These men, with their simplistic view of the world, were utterly transparent. Their strength was a hollow shell, built on noise and numbers, fragile as an egg. His hand slipped into the pocket of his jeans, his fingers closing around a small, smooth stone. It was a worry stone, flat and gray, taken from a dry riverbed in the Pesh Valley. He had picked it up on the worst day of his life, the day he'd lost 2 men under his command. He had carried it ever since. It was a touchstone to a part of himself that no one in this manicured suburban world knew existed. As his fingers traced its familiar contours, the memory rose, unbidden but not unwelcome. The smell of cordite and dust, the rhythmic crack of incoming fire, the impossible weight of a friend's body, the absolute ice-cold clarity that came in those moments, where all that existed was the mission, the team, and the will to survive. Compared to that, Mark's blustering was nothing more than the buzzing of a fly. Sarah finally stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself slightly behind David, as if seeking his protection even as her family threatened him. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of sound. "Let's not do this here. Let's just talk about this inside." Her weakness was like gasoline on the fire of their arrogance. Mark sneered. "We're past talking, little sister. Your husband needs to learn his place. He needs to understand that when you marry a woman from our family, you answer to all of us." David felt a pang of disappointment so sharp it was almost physical. He had hoped, even in that moment, that she would stand with him, that she would turn to her brothers and tell them to leave, that she would declare her loyalty to her husband, to their home. Instead, she had appealed for calm, placing the burden of de-escalation on everyone, validating no one. Her failure to choose was, in itself, a choice. The foundation of their marriage, he realized with a sudden, sickening certainty, had a crack running right through the center. He had built this house with his own hands, designed every joint and truss to be perfect, but he had miscalculated the integrity of the most important element, the partnership it was meant to house. He looked at the 18 men, and for the first time, a flicker of something cold and hard ignited within him. They weren't just insulting him, they were threatening his home, and that was a line he would not allow to be crossed. The pack, sensing a shift in the dynamic, grew bolder. One of the friends, a thick-necked man with a faded tattoo of a bulldog on his forearm, shouldered his way to the front. His name was Rick, and he was Mark's chief lieutenant, the muscle to his mouth. Rick's eyes were small and mean, and he radiated a cheap, barroom aggression. He lumbered up the 2 steps of the porch, violating the unspoken boundary David had established. He was now in David's personal space, close enough that David could smell the stale beer on his breath. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Rick growled, his voice a low rumble. "With your fancy books and your neat little drawings, you look down on us, men who work with their hands." David didn't answer. He simply held the man's gaze. He kept his own hands loose and open at his sides, a deliberate, non-threatening posture that his training had taught him was also the fastest path to a defensive action. "I'm talking to you," Rick said, his face reddening. He was used to men flinching, looking away. David's calm was infuriating to him. It was a denial of his power. To provoke a reaction, to force the submission he craved, he shoved David in the chest. It wasn't a hard shove, more of a test. A schoolyard bully's gambit. David absorbed the impact without moving his feet. His core was solid, his balance perfect. He simply allowed the force to dissipate through his body. He didn't retaliate. He didn't even blink. He just watched. This was a critical moment. His response would dictate the next phase of the confrontation. Anger would be a mistake. Fear would be a catastrophe. He had to remain in control not just of himself but of the entire situation. His mind continued its silent, ceaseless assessment. Rick was the primary immediate threat. His aggression was uncontrolled, making him predictable. Mark was the strategic threat, the leader who needed to be neutralized psychologically. The other 16 were the wild card, the mob that would follow the strongest signal. His objective was not to win a fight. It was to de-escalate and terminate the threat to his home with minimal necessary force. Violence was a tool, a last resort, not a solution. He glanced past Rick's shoulder, mapping the yard again. He noted the heavy iron arm of the porch swing, the precise distance to the edge of the stone steps, the placement of the large oak tree in the center of the lawn. These were not just features of his landscape. They were tactical elements. He wasn't planning a brawl. He was solving a complex, multivariable problem in real time. This was architecture of a different kind, the structuring of a conflict to achieve a desired outcome. "I have no problem with you, Rick," David said, his voice still maddeningly calm, "or with anyone here. My business is with my wife and her family. I would ask you to step off my porch." This quiet assertion of ownership, of boundaries, was more provocative to Rick than any insult. It was a rejection of the mob's authority. "You'd ask me?" Rick laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked over his shoulder at his friends, playing to his audience. "Hear that, boys? He'd ask me." The laughter from the lawn emboldened him. The entire group felt a surge of collective power. They saw David's non-reaction to the first shove as definitive proof of his cowardice. They were completely in control. Mark smiled, a predator's thin-lipped grin. This was going exactly as he had planned. He would break David down, humiliate him in front of his wife, and re-establish his family's dominance. Mark stepped forward again, reclaiming the spotlight. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at David with contempt. "It's over, David. This is how it's going to be. First, you're going to apologize to Kevin. A real apology. For making him look bad, he paused for effect. Second, you're going to reconsider my business offer. We'll call your $5,000 investment an apology loan to the family. A sign of good faith." The demand hung in the air, audacious and absurd. It wasn't about respect. It was about extortion. It was a power play, pure and simple. "And third," Mark said, his voice dropping, becoming more menacing, "you're going to start showing this family the proper respect. You're going to learn your place. You're part of our family now, and you'll act like it. Or we'll have to teach you. And we're very good teachers." The threat was clear. The 18 men shifted their weight, a subtle, collective movement of preparation. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken violence. The quiet of the suburban evening was gone, replaced by a tense, humming silence. David took a long, slow breath. He let the silence stretch, allowing their threats and their confidence to peak. He looked past them all, at the house he had so carefully restored. He saw the reclaimed cypress wood of the porch railing, the hand-blown glass in the antique windows. This wasn't just a structure, it was a sanctuary, his sanctuary, and they were desecrating it with their presence. He looked at Sarah, who was now weeping silently, her face buried in the dish towel. Her tears did not move him. Her moment to act had passed. This was no longer about her feelings or her family's pride. It was about a fundamental principle. A man's home is his castle, and he was its only defender. Finally, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Every man on the lawn fell silent to hear it. "You have said your piece," David stated, his tone flat and final. It was not a request. It was not a negotiation. It was the closing of a door. "Now I am going to ask you all one time. Leave my property." The simple, direct command was so unexpected, so contrary to their expectations of a cowering apology, that it stunned them for a beat. Rick was the first to recover. He let out a disbelieving laugh. "Or what?" he sneered, his face alight with malicious glee. "You gonna draw us a new porch?" He punctuated the insult with another shove. This one was different. It was not a test. It was an attack. He put his weight behind it, intending to send David stumbling backward into his own house, to physically dominate him and cement the mob's victory. And in that moment, everything changed. The shove landed, but it was like pushing against a steel column rooted in the earth. David didn't move backward. Instead, he moved with the energy of the push, a concept so foreign to a brawler like Rick that he couldn't process what was happening. As Rick's hands made contact, David's own hands came up, not to block, but to guide. His left hand cupped Rick's right elbow, while his right hand clamped down on the same wrist. It wasn't a strike. It was a connection. He became a part of Rick's own motion. What happened next was a blur of fluid, economical movement. David pivoted on the ball of his left foot, using Rick's forward momentum to spin him off balance. In the same seamless motion, he twisted the captured arm, applying pressure to the wrist, elbow, and shoulder joints simultaneously. It was a textbook compliance hold, executed with surgical precision. Rick's forward momentum became a spiraling descent. A strangled gasp of pain and surprise escaped his lips. His knees buckled, and the big man, who outweighed David by a good 50 pounds, crashed to the wooden porch on his knees. His face was contorted in a mask of agony. His tattooed arm held at an impossible angle. He wasn't just subdued, he was controlled. Utterly. The transition was shocking in its speed and silence. There was no grunt of effort from David, no furious cry. The architect, the quiet intellectual, had vanished. In his place stood someone else entirely. His posture had shifted. The relaxed, open stance was gone, replaced by a low, centered crouch. He was on the balls of his feet, balanced and ready. His eyes, which moments before had been calm and observant, were now cold and flat, scanning the remaining 17 threats with an unnerving intensity. It was a change so profound that it silenced the entire crowd. It was the posture of a predator, the absolute calm of a man who was not merely in his element, but who was the element, a force of nature they had foolishly tried to push. For a full second, the yard was frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The men stared at Rick, kneeling and gasping at David's feet, then back at David. Their brains struggled to reconcile the image of the soft-handed bookworm with the man who had just dismantled their toughest member without breaking a sweat. The spell was broken by a surge of collective rage and panic. Two men from the front rank, fueled by bravado and the need to defend their fallen friend, rushed the porch together. They were clumsy, their movements telegraphed, their anger making them sloppy. The first man threw a wild, looping punch aimed at David's head. David didn't duck or block. He moved inside the punch, his left hand deflecting the man's forearm while his right hand shot out and seized the man's wrist. He twisted, and the man yelped as a jolt of pure agony shot up his arm. His fingers went numb, his hands spasming open. A simple, debilitating wrist lock. David spun him, using his momentum to send him stumbling down the steps and into the man behind him. The second attacker, momentarily tangled with his friend, recovered and charged, his head lowered like a bull. David sidestepped with effortless grace. As the man blundered past, David's hand chopped down. Not with a fist, but with the rigid edge of his hand. The strike was not to the man's head or neck. It was a precise, calculated tap to a nerve cluster just above the collarbone. The effect was instantaneous and bizarre. The man's entire right side went limp. His leg gave out from under him, and he collapsed onto the grass in a heap, his face a mask of confusion. He wasn't knocked out. He was simply switched off. It had taken less than 5 seconds. 2 more men were down, neutralized with a terrifying efficiency that spoke not of a lucky street fighter, but of years of dedicated, lethal training. David let go of Rick, who scrambled backward off the porch on his hands and knees, crab walking away like a frightened child. David stood alone on his porch, breathing evenly, his heart rate perhaps now at 70. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He slowly raised his gaze from the 2 men on the ground and fixed it on Mark. The leader of the pack was standing frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his face drained of all color. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The world he understood, a world governed by size and numbers and loud voices, had just been turned completely upside down. David finally spoke again. His voice was the same quiet, measured tone as before, but now it carried the weight of a revealed truth, the chilling authority of demonstrated power. "I served for 10 years, he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. 3rd Special Forces Group. You and your friends are not a threat to me. You are a liability on my property." He let that sink in, letting them process the name, the implication. Special Forces. Green Beret. A phantom from news reports and action movies. Now standing on a suburban porch in a polo shirt and jeans. "I am going to say it one last time. Leave." As if on cue, a pair of headlights cut through the twilight, sweeping across the stunned faces on the lawn. A dark sedan pulled up to the curb. The engine cut, and a man in his late 50s, with short-cropped gray hair and a ramrod-straight posture, stepped out. He was wearing civilian clothes, a blazer and slacks, but he moved with an unmistakable military bearing. He took in the scene at a glance. The 18 men, the 2 on the ground, David standing calmly on the porch. His eyes narrowed slightly. He walked calmly onto the lawn, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed Mark's manufactured dominance. He walked right through the group of men, who parted for him instinctively, like iron filings before a magnet. He stopped at the foot of the porch and looked up at David. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "Everything all right here, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice calm and resonant. The word sergeant hung in the air, an irrefutable confirmation that vaporized the last vestiges of the mob's bravado. It wasn't a boast from David. It was a fact, delivered by a third party whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. This was Colonel Miller, David's former commanding officer and current mentor. A man David had invited for a quiet dinner, a dinner that was now significantly delayed. The collapse was total and immediate. The confidence of the 18 men didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. They looked at the 2 men now struggling to their feet, one nursing a throbbing arm, the other trying to understand why his leg wouldn't work properly. They looked at David, who seemed to have grown in stature, his quietness no longer appearing as weakness but as a form of immense, restrained power. And they looked at the newcomer, the colonel, whose calm appraisal felt more intimidating than any physical threat. The pack was broken. They were no longer an intimidating force. They were just a bunch of guys in over their heads, trespassing on the property of a man they now understood they should have feared. Mark, the self-proclaimed leader, was a wreck. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He stammered, trying to piece together an explanation that wouldn't make him sound like a complete fool. We were just talking, he managed, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. A family misunderstanding. Colonel Miller gave him a look that could have stripped paint from a battleship. It was a look of pure, undiluted contempt, honed over 30 years of dealing with posturing idiots and second lieutenants. "It looks like your talk is over," the colonel said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. "I suggest you and your friends collect your wounded and remove yourselves from this property before the local police arrive, and you have to explain what a family misunderstanding involving assault and criminal trespassing looks like on a legal document." The mention of police sent a fresh wave of panic through the group. Their suburban rebellion suddenly had real-world consequences. They began to back away, a clumsy, disorganized retreat. They helped their two friends up, who were groaning and confused, their brief, violent encounter leaving them more bewildered than injured. The retreat was a study in humiliation. There was no defiance, no parting shots, just averted eyes and hurried steps. They piled back into their trucks and cars, the doors slamming with a tinny, final sound. Engines started, and one by one, they drove away, vanishing into the quiet suburban night they had so rudely disturbed. The silence that descended on the lawn was profound. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. The air, which had been thick with aggression, now felt clean and empty. David's posture finally relaxed. The soldier receded, and the architect returned, though he felt 100 years older. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned his head and looked at Sarah. She was standing in the same spot, by the door, the damp dish towel still clutched in her hand. But her expression had changed. The fear and guilt were still there, but they were now overshadowed by something else. A bewildering combination of awe and deep, gut-wrenching shame. She was staring at her husband as if seeing him for the very first time. The quiet, gentle man she had married, the man she had secretly, perhaps, thought was a little too soft, was this. This man who could face down an army without raising his voice. This man who moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. The man she had failed to defend had never been in need of her defense. He had been in need of her loyalty, and in that she had failed him completely. The colonel walked up the steps and clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "Sorry I'm late," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Looks like I missed the appetizers." David managed a weak smile. "Something like that. Thanks for the timing, sir." "Never call me sir again, David. We're both civilians now," Miller said, though the habit was hard to break for both of them. He glanced back at Sarah, his expression softening with a hint of pity. "You two have a lot to talk about. My dinner invitation can wait." With a nod, the colonel retreated to his car, leaving David and Sarah alone on the porch, illuminated by the warm, unforgiving light from their home. A chasm had opened between them, wide and deep. David turned to face her fully. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired and profoundly disappointed. "You let this happen, Sarah?" he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but it struck her harder than any shout. "You invited them here, to our home. You stood there and you let them threaten me. You let them threaten us." This was the true confrontation, the one that mattered far more than the aborted brawl on the lawn. This was the battle for the heart of their marriage. Sarah finally broke. The silent tears became racking sobs. A torrent of apologies, excuses, and explanations poured out of her. She had been scared. She didn't know what to do. She never thought it would go this far. She had been raised to believe her brothers were her protectors, that their judgment was law. David listened without interrupting. The architect in him saw the problem with painful clarity. He had designed and built a beautiful house, but he had built it on a flawed foundation. A foundation of secrets and assumptions. He had never told her about his past, not because he was ashamed, but because he had desperately wanted to leave that world behind. He wanted to be David the architect, not Sergeant Evans the Green Beret. He had wanted a life of peace and creation, not conflict and destruction. And she, in turn, had never truly seen him. She had seen a projection of what she thought a quiet man should be, safe, stable, and perhaps a little weak. They had built a life together based on incomplete blueprints. The structure was beautiful, but it was not sound. And tonight, the first real storm had hit, and the cracks were showing everywhere. A house with a cracked foundation, he knew, could not stand for long. It either had to be repaired, reinforced from the ground up, or it had to be torn down. The days that followed were filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. David and Sarah moved around each other like ghosts in their own home. The unspoken truths of that evening a constant presence between them. The house itself, once a source of shared pride, now felt like a stage set for a tragedy. David found himself in his study for hours, staring at blueprints for other people's homes, finding a sterile comfort in the clean lines and precise calculations, a world where stress and load could be perfectly managed. Sarah tried to fill the silence with nervous chatter, with offers of food David didn't eat and conversations he wouldn't engage in. Her apologies had become a constant refrain, but they were like rain on a stone, washing over the surface without penetrating the deep hurt beneath. A week after the incident, David's phone rang. It was Mark. His voice on the other end was almost unrecognizable. The arrogant, booming tone was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy voice laced with a palpable fear. "David? This is Mark. I wanted to apologize." He sounded like a teenager calling to confess he'd broken a window. David was silent for a moment, waiting. "I was out of line," Mark continued, rushing to fill the void. "We were all out of line. Look, I have a buddy who works with some government contractors. I asked him, just out of curiosity, what a guy in the 3rd Special Forces Group does. He told me some stories." Mark's voice cracked. "Jesus, David. We had no idea. You could have. He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what they had done, the monumental, catastrophic stupidity of their actions, had finally sunk in. They had brought a stick to a gunfight they hadn't even known was happening. "We're so sorry," Mark pleaded. "We'll pay for any damages. Anything. Just tell us what you want." David leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the lawn, now peaceful and green. The anger he had felt was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. He didn't want their money. He didn't want their fear. Vengeance was a fool's game. "I don't want anything from you, Mark," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But the only person you owe anything to is your sister," David cut in. "You need to have a long talk with her. You and all your brothers. You need to decide what kind of family you want to be. One that solves problems with threats and intimidation, or one that respects the choices she makes, and the man she chose to build a life with." He paused. "That's the only conversation that matters now," he ended the call, leaving Mark to sit with the weight of that responsibility. That evening, David finally spoke to Sarah. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply laid out the truth as he saw it. "The foundation is broken, Sarah," he said, the architectural metaphor the most natural language for him to use. "What you did, it wasn't just about being scared. It was a choice. You chose their way over our way. You chose their values over ours. I don't know if that can be fixed." For the first time, Sarah didn't just apologize. She listened. She finally understood that her "I'm sorry" was meaningless without a true understanding of the damage she had caused. That night, they talked for hours. For the first time, David told her about his past. Not the heroic stories, but the hard ones. The loss, the fear, the crushing weight of responsibility. He explained that his quietness wasn't a personality flaw. It was a discipline, a wall he had built to keep the chaos of that world from bleeding into this one. And she, in turn, told him about growing up in a house where love and approval were conditional, where her brother's aggressive dominance was presented as the only valid form of strength. She had been taught to defer to them, to see their bullying as a form of protection. They started counseling the following week. The sessions were raw and difficult. They were dismantling their marriage down to the studs, examining every beam and joint for weakness. It was painful, meticulous work, but for the first time, it felt like they were building something real together, not just cohabiting in a beautiful but hollow structure. A month later, David had dinner with Colonel Miller. They sat on the back patio, the grill smoking gently. "Heard you and the wife are in therapy," Miller said, not as a question but as a statement. The man had his sources. David nodded, sipping his beer. "We're working on it." "Good," Miller said, his gaze firm. "You can't build a new life by burying the old one, son. That foundation you're so fond of talking about? It has to be built on the whole truth. All of it. She needed to see who you are. The man who can design a perfect Victorian porch, and the man who can clear a room in under 3 seconds. You're not one or the other, David. You're both. She has to love both." The colonel's words were a dose of tough, practical wisdom, the kind David had come to rely on. He was right. Hiding a part of himself hadn't protected his new life. It had left it vulnerable. The slow, arduous process of rebuilding continued. There were setbacks, moments of doubt and old resentments. But there was also progress. Sarah began to stand up to her family in small ways, drawing boundaries with a confidence she'd never had before. She was no longer asking for their approval, but simply stating her decisions. Her brothers, humbled and still slightly terrified of their brother-in-law, started to listen. Their relationship with David was strained, but it was now based on a foundation of profound, if grudging, respect. They had seen the wolf and they now understood the value of the shepherd. Months later, the smell of charcoal and grilled chicken once again filled the air in David and Sarah's backyard. It was a family barbecue, the first one since the incident. It was Sarah's idea, a tentative step toward a new kind of normal. The brothers were all there. The boisterous, swaggering energy was gone. They were quiet, almost subdued. They spoke to David with a careful deference, asking his opinion on the stock market, on a leaky roof, on the best way to stain a deck. They were seeing him now not as an outsider, but as an anchor, a source of quiet strength they had completely failed to recognize. Kevin, the youngest brother, the catalyst for the whole confrontation, approached David by the grill. He had a beer in his hand and an anxious expression on his face. "David," he said, his voice low, I wanted to apologize. For real this time. About that dinner. You were right about the town hall. I was just talking big. And I was a jerk."
"I'm sorry."
David looked at the young man, who was now just a kid trying to find his footing, and nodded. He clapped him on the shoulder. "It's forgotten, Kevin. Bring me a plate. These burgers are ready." The gesture was one of simple grace, of forgiveness without fanfare. It was the act of a truly strong man, one who had no need to hold a grudge or prove a point. His point had been made. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn where the confrontation had taken place, Sarah came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just slipped her hand into his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt different now. It wasn't the hand of a woman seeking protection, but the hand of a partner offering it. Their connection was still healing, but it was real, forged in the fire of a hard-won truth. They were rebuilding together. The house stood, its foundation stronger than ever before. David looked out at the gathering. He saw a family that was learning, slowly and painfully, to redefine its values. He had never wanted to fight them. He had never wanted to be their enemy or their master. He had simply wanted peace. He had wanted respect. He had learned long ago, in the harshest classrooms in the world, that true strength was not about the noise you make or the force you project. It was about the quiet competence you hold in reserve. It was about patience, integrity, and the courage to protect your peace without sacrificing your principles. The strongest people, he knew, were the ones who had nothing to prove. And in the quiet warmth of that evening, surrounded by a family that was finally beginning to understand, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing for a very long time. We've seen tonight how dramatically things can change when we misjudge someone based on appearances. The quietest person in the room is often the one with the most profound strength. It makes you wonder, what do you think is the most important quality in a partner or a friend? Is it the strength you can see every day, or the hidden strength they hold in reserve for when it's needed most? Share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. If you found this story satisfying, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all that there is always more than meets the eye. We'll see you next time.